My mother sold her wedding ring to pay my brother's bar tab from a business dinner he never actually attended. I found that out by accident, 3 years after it happened, going through a shoebox of receipts while she slept in the next room, too weak by then to sit up on her own for more than a few minutes at a time. I sat on her kitchen floor at 11 at night holding a pawn shop receipt with her handwriting on it, and I thought about all the years I'd spent believing I simply wasn't loved as much as my brother was, when the truth, it turned out, was so much more specific and so much more expensive than that. She gave him everything. Every chance, every dollar, every excuse. And when there was finally nothing left to give, when her body started failing in the quiet, undramatic way bodies eventually do, it wasn't him standing in her kitchen at 11 at night. It was me. It was always, in the end, going to be me. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where we believe that love, the real kind, shows up in the unglamorous hours nobody's watching, and that the people who disappear when things get hard were never quite as devoted as they liked to appear when things were easy. If you've ever been the dependable one in a family that never seemed to notice how much you were carrying, I want you to stay with me for this one, because I think you'll recognize more of it than you'd like to. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a physical therapist outside of Sacramento, a job I chose, if I'm honest, partly because I liked the specific satisfaction of watching someone regain something they thought they'd lost for good. I didn't grow up wealthy, but I didn't grow up poor either. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in a modest suburb, raised almost entirely by my mother, Linda Brooks, after my father left when I was 6 and my brother, Jason Brooks, was 9. My mother never remarried. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, a receptionist during the week and a bookkeeper for a family friend's restaurant on weekends, and she did it, she told us more than once, so that neither of her children would ever have to feel like they were going without. What I understand now, in a way I couldn't possibly have understood as a child, is that my mother's love was never actually divided equally between us, even though I don't think she ever once believed that about herself. Jason Brooks was 3 years older than me, and from as early as I can remember, he occupied a different category in our house entirely, not just as the older sibling, but as the one whose failures were always explained and whose successes were always celebrated, while mine were expected, quietly, as simply the baseline of what a daughter was supposed to do. I don't say that with the kind of bitterness I might have said it with 10 years ago. I say it now the way you describe whether you lived inside for a very long time, plainly, because it's simply what happened. Jason Brooks struggled in school, and my mother hired him tutors we couldn't really afford. I struggled once, in 9th grade, with a geometry class that nearly broke me, and I was told, gently but unmistakably, that I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, because I always had been. It wasn't cruelty. I want to be fair to her, even now. It was simply the specific, invisible logic of a household where one child was treated as fragile and in need of protecting, and the other was treated as sturdy enough to never really need it. I remember asking my mother once, years later, whether she ever noticed the difference in how she treated the 2 of us growing up, and she told me, without much hesitation, that Jason Brooks had always been sensitive underneath his confidence, prone to giving up entirely the moment something felt too hard, while I had always been the kind of child who simply kept going regardless of the obstacle in front of me. She meant it, I think, as a genuine compliment, a description of my resilience rather than an admission of anything unequal. What she didn't seem to fully register, even as she said it, was that resilience isn't actually something children are simply born with in fixed supply. It's something they build, often because nobody gives them any other option, and the specific irony of being praised for a strength you were never really allowed to choose is one that took me a long time to fully name. By the time Jason Brooks graduated high school, a full 2 years late after failing his junior year twice, my mother had already begun a pattern that would define the next 2 decades of our family's finances. Quietly absorbing the cost of every one of his setbacks so that he would never have to fully sit inside the consequences of them. She paid for a semester of community college he dropped out of after 6 weeks. She co-signed a car loan he defaulted on within a year, a debt that took her nearly 4 years to fully pay off on her own. She never told me the full extent of it at the time. I only pieced it together much later, the way you piece together a pattern you were too close to see clearly while you were living inside it. I went a different direction. I got a partial scholarship to a state university 2 hours from home, took out loans for the rest, and worked 25 hours a week on top of a full course load to cover what the loans and scholarship didn't. I didn't resent it, not then. I actually took a kind of quiet pride in it, in the specific way you take pride in something nobody has to prop up for you. I finished my undergraduate degree in 4 years, went straight into a graduate program for physical therapy, and by 26, I had a license, a modest apartment I paid for entirely myself, and a growing sense that whatever I built from that point forward, I had actually built. Jason Brooks, meanwhile, drifted through most of his 20s in a way that somehow always seemed to circle back to my mother's checkbook. A failed attempt at a food truck business that ate through nearly $15,000 of her retirement savings before folding within a year. A brief, disastrous marriage that ended with my mother quietly covering his portion of an apartment lease he couldn't afford alone. A string of jobs that never lasted more than a year, each ending, according to Jason Brooks, because of some manager or company that simply hadn't recognized his potential. My mother believed him every time, or at least she chose to, in the specific way people choose to believe the version of a story that lets them keep loving someone the way they've always loved them. I think, looking back, the clearest early sign of the pattern came the summer I was 14 and Jason Brooks was 17, the summer he wrecked the family car 2 weeks after getting his license, driving well past curfew to a party he'd told my mother he wasn't attending. I remember the specific quiet of our kitchen the next morning, my mother on the phone with the insurance company, her voice carefully even, and I remember, more than anything, the absence of the punishment I fully expected to follow. There wasn't a punishment, not really. There was a lecture, delivered gently, and then, within a month, a newer, nicer car than the one he'd destroyed, purchased, I later learned, with money my mother had been quietly saving toward a kitchen renovation she never ended up getting. I didn't understand, at 14, what that particular exchange actually meant. I only understood, in the specific, wordless way children absorb things, that consequences in our house were a variable that applied differently depending on who you were. I want to walk you through what it actually felt like from the inside, because I think the specific texture of it matters more than the general shape. It wasn't one dramatic moment of my mother choosing him over me. It was hundreds of small ones, so ordinary and so spread out across years that no single one of them ever seemed worth making an issue over, until eventually they added up into something I could no longer pretend not to see. There was the summer I turned 29, when I put a down payment on my first house, a small 2-bedroom bungalow I'd saved for over 6 careful years, and my mother came to see it, walked through every room, told me how proud she was, and then spent most of the visit on the phone in the backyard, quietly arranging to wire Jason Brooks another $4,000 for a business opportunity that, like the ones before it, would collapse within the year. I remember standing in my own kitchen, in a house I had built entirely with my own hands and my own discipline, listening to her voice through the screen door, and understanding, with a kind of dull, resigned clarity, exactly where I stood in the order of things. There was Christmas, most years, where the gifts under the tree told their own quiet story if you were paying attention, practical, thoughtful things for me, the kind of gifts you give someone you trust to appreciate them regardless of their size. And something considerably larger for Jason Brooks almost every year, a gesture my mother always framed as him simply needing a little extra help getting back on his feet, as though every year was a uniquely unfortunate exception rather than the pattern it had clearly become. There was the conversation, when I was 31, where I finally, carefully, tried to bring it up directly, sitting across from her at her kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, telling her, as gently as I knew how, that I sometimes felt like the differences in how she supported us weren't really about need, but about something else I couldn't quite name. She got quiet, the specific kind of quiet that meant I'd struck something true, and then she told me, with what I believe was genuine hurt in her voice, that she loved us both exactly the same, that Jason Brooks simply needed more help than I did. And that she didn't understand why I would begrudge my own brother for struggling with things that had always come more easily to me. I didn't push it further that night, partly because I could see how much the conversation was costing her, and partly because some old, deeply worn part of me still wanted, more than I wanted to be right, to be told I was wrong, that I'd misread the whole thing, that the love had actually been equal all along and I'd simply been too insecure to feel it properly. I left that conversation the way I left most conversations like it over the years, with the specific ache of having said something true and having it gently, lovingly, completely dismissed. I want to be honest about something else, because I think it matters to understanding the rest of this story. I didn't stop loving my mother during those years. I didn't even stop being close to her, in the ordinary, day-to-day sense of the word. We talked most weeks. I helped her with things around the house, drove her to appointments when she asked, showed up for every holiday and birthday without exception. The imbalance in how she loved us never turned into distance between us, not exactly. It simply became a quiet, permanent weather system I learned to live inside, the same way you learn to live inside a climate you didn't choose and can't change, adjusting your expectations instead of the conditions themselves. By my early 30s, I had built a genuinely good life. A steady career I found meaningful. A house that was fully, legally mine. A small, close circle of friends who knew me as someone reliable, someone who showed up, someone who didn't need managing. I had made a kind of peace with the specific shape of my relationship with my mother, not because it stopped hurting entirely, but because I had learned, the way you learn anything you have to live with long enough, how to carry it without it constantly showing on my face. There's one more memory from those years I think about often, from my 30th birthday, which happened to fall the same weekend as one of Jason Brooks's larger financial emergencies, a missed rent payment that risked an eviction notice if it wasn't resolved within days. My mother came to my small birthday dinner, stayed for barely an hour, apologized for having to leave early, and I found out afterward, through a cousin who happened to mention it in passing, that she'd spent the rest of that evening at the bank, arranging an emergency transfer to cover Jason Brooks's rent before the notice became official. I didn't say anything to her about it at the time. I remember sitting at that dinner table with my closest friends, blowing out 30 candles, and feeling, underneath the ordinary happiness of the evening, a specific, quiet loneliness I couldn't fully explain to anyone sitting there with me, because none of them had grown up inside the particular arithmetic I had, where an hour of my mother's presence had always, somehow, felt like the version of enough I was supposed to be grateful for. One of my closest friends, Amanda Reed, who had known me since graduate school and had slowly, over the years, pieced together enough of the family history to understand the shape of it without my ever having to spell it out completely, pulled me aside near the end of that dinner and asked, gently, whether I was okay. I told her I was fine, the same automatic answer I'd been giving for most of my adult life, and she just looked at me for a long moment, the way people look at you when they know the real answer and are simply waiting to see if you're ready to say it yourself. I wasn't, not that night. It would be another several years before I was. Jason Brooks's life, over that same stretch of years, followed its own familiar arc, one more failed venture after another, each one slightly larger and slightly more expensive than the last, each one softened, every time, by our mother's quiet, unwavering financial rescue. By his late 30s, he had gone through, by my own rough calculation years later, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 of her money, spread out across business failures, debt consolidations, and what she euphemistically called a rough patch, a phrase that, over the years, came to cover an enormous amount of specific, ordinary financial ruin. What I didn't fully understand until much later was exactly how much of her own financial security she had quietly sacrificed to keep him afloat. My mother had worked for nearly 30 years, had a modest but genuinely solid retirement account by her late 50s, the kind of nest egg built slowly and carefully by someone who understood, better than almost anyone I knew, the value of a dollar earned through actual labor. By the time she turned 65, that account had been drawn down to almost nothing, not through any single catastrophic decision, but through years of smaller ones, each individually defensible, each one a mother helping a struggling son, that had collectively hollowed out the safety net she'd spent 3 decades building. I found this out, the specific full scope of it, almost by accident, during a conversation with her financial advisor when I helped her sort through some paperwork after a minor health scare in her late 60s, a fall that had put her in the hospital overnight for observation and had, more than the fall itself, made me start paying closer attention to the details of her life that I'd never previously had reason to examine. I sat across from a kind, slightly uncomfortable man named Michael Turner, who walked me through statements I hadn't known existed, showing me, with the careful, apologetic tone of someone delivering unwelcome news, exactly how thin my mother's financial cushion had actually become. I remember driving home from that meeting in a kind of stunned, quiet fog, doing math in my head I didn't want to be doing, understanding, for the first time with real specificity, that my mother, who had spent her entire life being careful, being responsible, being exactly the kind of person who was supposed to be financially secure by this point in her life, was, in fact, dangerously close to not being able to fully support herself, largely because of decades of decisions made in service of a son who had, as far as I could tell, never once offered to pay any of it back, and had, as far as I could also tell, never once been asked to. I didn't confront Jason Brooks about it directly, not at first. I confronted my mother instead, gently, the same kind of gentle I'd tried once before at her kitchen table years earlier, except this time I had numbers, specific and undeniable, laid out in front of both of us, printed pages I'd spent an entire evening organizing chronologically, because I understood, by that point, that vague impressions had never once been enough to move her, and that only something concrete, something she couldn't quietly reason her way around the way she'd reasoned her way around every uncomfortable conversation before it, had any real chance of landing. She cried, that day, in a way I hadn't seen her cry in years, not defensive exactly, but exhausted, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent decades making a choice she's never once let herself fully examine, because examining it would have required admitting something about her own parenting she wasn't ready to admit. She told me, through tears, that she knew, on some level, that she'd given Jason Brooks more than she'd given me, but that every time he called, struggling, desperate, she simply couldn't bring herself to say no, because she was terrified, in some deep, specific way she couldn't fully articulate even to herself, of what might happen to him if she did. I asked her, as carefully as I could, what she thought might happen to her, if the pattern continued the way it had been going. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think, until that conversation, she had ever actually let herself ask the question. Michael Turner, the financial advisor, told me something else that day that I've never fully been able to shake, delivered almost as an aside while he gathered his files at the end of our meeting. He said that in nearly 20 years of managing retirement accounts, he'd seen a specific, recognizable pattern more times than he could count: parents, usually mothers, quietly liquidating their own future security in small, incremental pieces to rescue an adult child from consequences the child never fully had to face, and that in almost every case he'd witnessed, the parent had genuinely believed, right up until the money ran out, that they were being generous rather than being, in his words, gently but pointedly, complicit in keeping their child from ever having to grow up. I didn't say anything in response. I simply thanked him, gathered my own folder of statements, and drove home turning that phrase over and over in my mind, complicit in keeping their child from ever having to grow up, because it named something I'd felt for years without ever having the specific language for it. If you've ever watched someone you love make the same costly choice again and again, unable to stop even once they can see exactly where it's leading, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time right now, because I promise you, the reckoning in this story arrives from a direction none of us expected, and it isn't the one you're probably imagining. Things didn't change dramatically after that conversation with my mother, not the way I'd hoped they would. She made a few adjustments, tightened her budget, stopped covering Jason Brooks's rent outright the way she had been, but the underlying pattern never fully broke, because the underlying pattern was never really about money in the first place. It was about a fear, old and deeply rooted, that if she ever stopped being useful to Jason Brooks, stopped being the soft place he could always fall back into, she might lose him entirely, the same way, in some sense, she'd already lost my father decades earlier. I want to talk about Jason Brooks specifically for a moment, because I think it's important not to flatten him into a simple villain in this story, even though I understand exactly why it would be easier to. Jason Brooks wasn't cruel, not in any deliberate, calculated way. I don't believe he ever sat down and consciously decided to drain our mother's retirement savings while his sister built a stable life on her own. I think, if I'm being as fair as I can be, that Jason Brooks simply grew up inside a system that told him, consistently and from a very early age, that struggle was something that happened to him rather than something he was responsible for navigating, and that someone, specifically our mother, would always be there to absorb the consequences before they ever fully landed. He wasn't manipulating her, most of the time. He genuinely, I believe, didn't know how to exist any other way. That doesn't mean I wasn't angry. I was, for years, in a quiet, controlled way I rarely let show, because showing it felt, somehow, like it would only confirm whatever unflattering story my mother had quietly built about me being the less generous, less understanding of her two children. I went to therapy, eventually, in my early 30s, partly because of the specific weight of all of this, and my therapist, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Sophia Williams, said something to me during one of our early sessions that I still think about regularly. She said that the children of favoritism rarely resent the favored sibling as much as people assume. What they resent, more specifically and more painfully, is having to prove, over and over, that their needs are real, in a family where one person's needs were simply always assumed to be real without question. I sat with that for a long time. I think it's the most accurate description anyone has ever given me of what those years actually felt like from the inside. By the time I turned 34, my relationship with Jason Brooks had thinned considerably, not through any dramatic falling out, but through the slow, quiet erosion that happens when two people's lives simply stop overlapping in any meaningful way. We saw each other at holidays, exchanged the occasional text, maintained the specific, careful politeness of siblings who love each other in theory but no longer know each other in practice. My mother, meanwhile, continued on largely as she always had, working part-time well past the age most people retire, because she genuinely could not afford not to. Still, in small quiet ways I only sometimes caught glimpses of, finding money to send Jason Brooks whenever he called. I didn't know, during any of this, that the ground underneath all of us was about to shift in a way none of the old patterns had prepared any of us for. My mother's diagnosis came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in March, 2 years ago now, delivered over the phone in the specific, careful language doctors use when they're trying to soften something that cannot actually be softened. Early-stage Parkinson's disease, the neurologist explained, complicated further, within the same appointment, by a heart condition that had apparently been quietly developing for years without anyone noticing, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't arrive all at once so much as it arrives in layers, each one requiring its own adjustment before the next one even fully lands. I remember exactly where I was standing when she called to tell me, in my kitchen, halfway through making dinner, and I remember the specific way her voice sounded, steady in the way she'd always been steady, trying, even in that moment, to manage my reaction more than she was allowing herself to process her own. She told me not to worry, that it was early, that the doctors were optimistic about the progression being slow, and I believed her, mostly, because believing her was easier than sitting with what I already suspected, which was that my mother, at 68 years old, with almost no financial safety net left and 2 children who had spent the last decade drifting slowly apart, was about to need a level of care that none of us had ever actually planned for. I called Jason Brooks that same night, the specific, careful call you make when you're trying to bring a family back together around something that actually matters, laying out what the doctor had told me, the practical realities of what the coming years might look like, the conversations we needed to start having about her care, her finances, her living situation. He was kind on the phone, genuinely, in the way I think he was always capable of being kind when the moment in front of him was clear enough to actually see. He said all the right things. He said he'd come by more, that we'd figure it out together, that Mom had always taken care of everyone else and now it was our turn to take care of her. I want to tell you that he followed through on that, because for the first few months, in a small, specific way, he actually did. He visited more often. He drove her to 2 of her early appointments. He seemed, for a stretch of time I now recognize as painfully brief, like a genuinely different person than the one I'd spent the last decade quietly resenting. It didn't last. It rarely does, in patterns this old and this deeply worn. By the summer, Jason Brooks's visits had thinned back out to their old, familiar rhythm, a call here, a brief stop there, always with some explanation. Work had gotten busier, his own life had gotten complicated in ways he described only vaguely, and I found myself, without ever having a specific conversation about it, quietly absorbing the entire weight of my mother's care almost entirely on my own. I didn't resent it immediately, if I'm honest. There was a part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of but also not ashamed of, that felt something almost like vindication in those early months, the sense of finally being needed in a way that felt real and undeniable, after decades of feeling like my own needs had never quite registered as real in comparison to Jason Brooks's. I told myself I was doing it because it was right, because she was my mother and she needed help and I was capable of giving it. That was true. It was also, I understand now, only part of the truth. I remember one appointment in particular, about 4 months after the diagnosis, sitting beside her in the neurologist's office while he explained, in careful, unhurried terms, what the coming years were likely to look like, the specific progression of symptoms, the medications we'd need to manage as her condition advanced, the physical modifications our home would eventually require. My mother listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, and it wasn't until we were back in the car, in the parking garage, that she finally allowed herself to cry, not about the diagnosis itself, she told me, but about the specific, sudden realization that Jason Brooks hadn't been able to make it to this particular appointment, the one where the actual shape of her future had finally been laid out in plain, clinical language. I held her hand in that parking garage for a long time before either of us said anything else, and I remember thinking, with a kind of tired, resigned clarity, that I already knew, without needing to be told, exactly how much of what came next was going to fall to me. The next year and a half unfolded in the specific, exhausting rhythm that anyone who has cared for an aging or ill parent will recognize immediately, a rhythm made up almost entirely of small, unglamorous tasks that never make it into the version of a story people tell at dinner parties. Doctor's appointments, sometimes 2 or 3 a week during the harder stretches. Medication schedules that had to be tracked with an almost obsessive precision, because my mother's Parkinson's medications required exact timing to remain effective. Insurance paperwork that seemed designed, deliberately, to exhaust anyone who tried to navigate it. Home modifications, grab bars and ramps and a stair lift we installed the year her balance started genuinely worrying me, all of it paid for, largely, out of my own savings, because her retirement account, exactly as thin as I'd feared years earlier, simply couldn't absorb the cost. I didn't ask Jason Brooks for money during that stretch, and I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. I didn't ask because some old, deeply worn part of me already knew, with a kind of tired certainty, exactly what the answer would be. And I didn't have the emotional bandwidth left, on top of everything else, to sit with the specific hurt of hearing him say no, or worse, of hearing him say yes and then quietly not follow through. I simply, quietly, absorbed the costs myself, the way I'd absorbed most things throughout my life, without making it anyone else's problem, because making it someone else's problem had never once, in my entire life, actually worked. If you've ever found yourself becoming the one who holds everything together while someone else gets to remain, somehow, endlessly forgiven for holding nothing at all, hit subscribe to Calm Stories time now, because I promise you, this part of the story is not where it ends. I moved my mother into my house during the 2nd year, into the guest bedroom I converted into something closer to a small, self-contained living space, a decision I made carefully, deliberately, after her balance had deteriorated to the point where living alone genuinely wasn't safe anymore. I adjusted my work schedule, dropped to part-time hours at the clinic, took on a handful of home visit clients instead to make up some of the lost income, and rebuilt almost every part of my daily life around a rhythm that centered, almost entirely, on my mother's care. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't do this out of some pure, uncomplicated well of love, untouched by everything that had come before it. I did it because I loved her, genuinely, but I also did it carrying every single year of the imbalance I'd spent my whole life quietly cataloging, the version of me who still, somewhere underneath the adult I'd become, wanted, more than almost anything, to finally be the child who mattered, even if it took her getting sick for that to become true. I'm not proud of that particular tangle of motives. I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't there, because I think the honest, complicated truth serves this story better than a cleaner, simpler version would. Jason Brooks's visits during this stretch grew even more infrequent, not through any dramatic decision to withdraw, but through the specific, slow momentum of someone who has never had to be the reliable one and simply doesn't know how to start being that person under pressure. He called our mother regularly, which I want to give him credit for, genuine, warm calls that visibly lifted her mood every time. But calls, I learned very quickly, do not change medication schedules, do not install stair lifts, do not sit up at 2 in the morning during the nights her tremors made it hard for her to sleep. There was a specific weekend, near the end of that second year, when I'd asked Jason Brooks weeks in advance to stay with our mother for 2 nights so I could attend a close friend's wedding out of state, the first trip I'd taken anywhere in over a year. He agreed readily, the way he always agreed to things in the abstract, and then, 4 days before the wedding, called to say something had come up, a work commitment he described only vaguely, and that he simply couldn't make it work. I didn't yell at him. I don't think I even raised my voice. I told him, quietly, that I understood, cancelled my flight, and spent that weekend exactly where I'd spent almost every other weekend that year, and it wasn't until I was alone in my kitchen that Saturday night, listening to my mother's medication alarm go off on schedule, that I let myself feel the full, specific weight of how alone I actually was inside all of it. The turning point, the one that changed everything about how I understood my entire relationship with both my mother and my brother, happened on an unremarkable Tuesday morning about 8 months into her living with me. She'd had a difficult night, more tremor than usual, and I'd stayed up with her until nearly 4 in the morning, and I remember sitting on the edge of her bed once she'd finally fallen asleep, exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way that had become almost ordinary for me by that point, and simply crying, quietly, in the dark, in a way I hadn't let myself do in months. She woke, I think, at some point during that, though I didn't realize it until she spoke, her voice thin but completely clear, asking me, gently, what was wrong. I told her, finally, everything I'd been carrying, not with anger exactly, though there was some of that underneath it, but with a kind of raw, unguarded honesty I'd never quite let myself offer her before. I told her how it had felt, growing up watching her give Jason Brooks everything while I learned, early and thoroughly, not to need anything from her at all. I told her how it felt now, doing all of this, every appointment, every sleepless night, every dollar quietly spent, while Jason Brooks called on the phone and got to remain, in her eyes, the good son, simply because being good over the phone had always been easier for him than being good in person. I braced myself, while I said it, for the same response I'd gotten years earlier at her kitchen table, the gentle deflection, the reassurance that she loved us both the same, the quiet dismissal that had always followed any attempt I'd made to name what I was actually feeling. It didn't come. Instead, in the specific, unguarded honesty that illness sometimes strips a person down to, she told me something I don't think she'd ever fully admitted to herself before that moment, let alone to me. She told me that she thought, somewhere deep down, she had always given Jason Brooks more because she was afraid of him, not physically, but in the specific way a parent can become afraid of losing a child's love if she ever stops rescuing him from himself. She said she thought, somewhere underneath all of it, she had always known I would be fine, would land on my feet, would build a life regardless of what she gave or didn't give me, and that some part of her, some part she was deeply ashamed of admitting out loud, had used that certainty as permission to worry less about me and more about him. She told me she was sorry, in a way that felt, for the first time in my entire life, completely unguarded, without the reflexive defensiveness that had always followed any earlier attempt to name the imbalance between us. She told me she understood, finally and fully, exactly what it had cost me, to spend a lifetime being the reliable one in a family that had never quite treated reliability as something worth rewarding. I didn't forgive her instantly, that night, sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning. I want to be honest about that too. But something shifted between us, something that had been calcified for over 3 decades, and it shifted in a way I don't think either of us fully expected it to. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in the way she talked about Jason Brooks, a new carefulness that hadn't been there before, less automatic defense of him, more willingness to sit in the discomfort of what her choices had actually cost, both of us. She asked me, a few days later, over breakfast, whether I thought it was too late to fix things, not just between her and me, but between the 3 of us as a family, and I remember not having a confident answer for her in that moment, because I genuinely didn't know. I told her the truth, that I didn't know whether it could be fixed, but that I was willing to find out, which was, I think, the most honest thing I'd said to her in years, and also, in its own quiet way, the beginning of something neither of us had the language for yet. If you've ever needed someone you love to simply see the pattern clearly, without you having to fight for years to make them see it, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because what happened over the following months surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. I called Jason Brooks the week after that conversation, not to relitigate the past, but to ask him, directly and specifically, for the first time in either of our lives, to take on a defined, concrete share of our mother's care, a specific weekend rotation, a portion of the financial costs going forward, a real, measurable commitment rather than the vague, well-meaning gestures he'd offered up until then. I laid it out plainly, with numbers and specifics rather than emotional appeals, because I understood, finally, that emotional appeals had never once, in the entire history of our family, been enough to change anything. Jason Brooks's reaction, to my genuine surprise, wasn't defensive. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had a rawness to it I hadn't heard from him in years, maybe ever. He told me he knew, had known for a long time exactly what I'd been carrying, and that he'd let himself avoid it because facing it directly would have meant facing something about himself he wasn't ready to face, the specific, uncomfortable truth that he had spent his entire adult life being rescued rather than becoming the kind of person capable of doing the rescuing. I won't tell you it was an immediate, total transformation, because that wouldn't be honest, and I've tried, throughout this whole story, to give you the honest version rather than the satisfying one. But Jason Brooks did begin showing up differently after that call, taking our mother for a defined set of appointments each month, covering a real, agreed-upon share of her care costs from savings I later learned he'd quietly built up over the previous year, in what I understood, once he told me about it, as his own private, unspoken attempt to start becoming someone capable of contributing rather than simply someone who was forgiven for not contributing. My mother's health, over that same stretch, continued its slow, uneven decline, the specific rhythm of Parkinson's, better days and harder days, rarely predictable, never entirely reversible. But something about the family around her had genuinely changed, and I think she felt it, in the way she started talking more openly, over the months that followed, about the years she'd spent making choices she now recognized, clearly and without the old defensiveness, as having cost me something real. There was an afternoon, about a year into all of this, when she asked me to help her go through some old paperwork, the specific, mundane task of sorting years of financial records into something more organized, and partway through, she pulled out an old pawnshop receipt, one I hadn't known existed until that exact moment, for a wedding ring she'd sold years earlier, quietly, without ever telling either of us, to cover a debt Jason Brooks had accumulated during one of his harder years. She told me, handing it to me, that she wanted me to have it, not the ring, which was long gone, but the receipt itself, as a strange, specific kind of acknowledgement, a physical piece of evidence of exactly what those years had actually cost, offered without excuse, for the first time in my life. I asked Jason Brooks about that receipt later, gently, curious whether he'd known at the time what our mother had sacrificed to cover that particular debt. He hadn't, he told me, his voice unsteady in a way I wasn't used to hearing from him, and when I showed him the actual piece of paper, he sat with it for a long time without saying anything, turning it over in his hands the way you might handle something you suddenly understand you were never supposed to see. He apologized to me that day, not in the vague, general way he'd apologized before, but specifically, naming individual years, individual debts, individual moments he now understood, clearly and without defensiveness, had come directly out of what should have been my mother's security, and by extension, indirectly but unmistakably, out of a version of fairness I'd been quietly denied for most of my life. I didn't need the apology to keep moving forward with him. I'm glad, all the same, that he finally offered it. I want to talk about what the last year has actually looked like, because I think the unglamorous, ongoing nature of it matters as much as the reckoning that led up to it. My mother's Parkinson's has progressed, slowly, the way the doctors told us it likely would, and she now needs more consistent daily care than she did even a year ago, help with medication, help with mobility on her harder days, the kind of steady, physical presence that doesn't resolve itself into a single dramatic story so much as it simply becomes the shape of ordinary life. Jason Brooks has remained genuinely, consistently involved, in a way that still occasionally surprises me, not because I don't believe people can change, but because I spent so many years building my expectations around a version of him that no longer entirely matches who he's become. He takes her every other weekend now, has learned her medication schedule as thoroughly as I have, has started, in small, specific ways, showing up not because our mother's illness finally gave him no other choice, but because something in him seems to have genuinely wanted to become someone capable of showing up. I've asked myself, more than once over this past year, whether I actually forgive him, or forgive her, for the 3 decades of imbalance that shaped almost every part of how I understand my own worth. I don't think forgiveness, in situations like this one, arrives as a single clean decision the way it sometimes does in the stories people tell about it. I think it arrives, if it arrives at all, the way most real things do, slowly, unevenly, revised almost daily by whatever happened most recently between the people involved. What I can tell you honestly is that I no longer carry the specific, corrosive belief I carried for most of my adult life, that my worth in my mother's eyes was somehow lower than my brother's, that I mattered less simply because I needed less. I understand now, in a way I didn't fully understand until I watched her actually need me, fully and undeniably, that the years of imbalance were never actually a verdict on how much she loved me. They were a reflection of her own fear, her own unresolved history, her own specific, human limitations, the same limitations every parent carries in one form or another, even the ones who manage to hide them better than mine did. I've also learned something about myself during this past year that I don't think I could have learned any other way, which is that I am capable of showing up fully for someone, completely and without reservation. Even after decades of feeling like my own needs had never quite been seen. I used to believe that the years of feeling unseen would eventually curdle into something bitter and withholding in me, the specific fear that having been shortchanged myself would make me incapable of giving generously to anyone else. It hasn't. If anything, I think it's made me more deliberate about the kind of care I offer, more attentive to the specific, unglamorous details that actually matter, because I know, in a way few people fully understand until they've lived it, exactly what it costs to go without that kind of attention for most of a lifetime. I started, about 6 months ago, seeing Dr. Sophia Williams again for a handful of sessions, mostly to talk through the strange, layered feelings of finally getting the acknowledgement I'd spent decades quietly hoping for, and finding that it didn't erase the years that came before it, only sat alongside them. She asked me once whether I thought my mother's illness was, in some way, the only thing that could have ever forced this particular reckoning, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I'd spent a long time being angry about the specific unfairness of that possibility, that it might have taken losing her health for her to finally see me clearly. I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty, not because it doesn't still sting sometimes, but because dwelling on the version of events that might have unfolded differently has never once changed the version that actually happened, and the version that actually happened is one where, eventually, however late, my mother finally saw the whole shape of what she'd done, and chose, with whatever time she had left, to do something different with it. Dr. Sophia Williams asked me, in that same conversation, what I thought I would say to the version of myself who sat in that 9th grade geometry class all those years ago, quietly absorbing the lesson that asking for help simply wasn't something available to her. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I think I would tell her that she was right to keep going on her own, because that resilience genuinely did build the life she eventually got to have, but that being capable was never supposed to mean being alone, and that somewhere down the road, capability and love were going to have a harder time finding their way back to each other than they should have, through absolutely no fault of her own. It's been just under 2 years now since that 4 a.m. conversation on the edge of my mother's bed, the one that finally cracked open 30 years of a pattern neither of us had ever fully named out loud. My mother still lives with me. Her care has become, in the specific way these things do, simply the architecture of my ordinary life rather than an exceptional circumstance I'm still adjusting to, woven into my work schedule, my weekends, the quiet rhythm of the house we now share. I've rebuilt my relationship with Jason Brooks slowly, the way you rebuild anything that's been thin for a long time, in small, specific gestures rather than one clean, dramatic reconciliation. We talk more now than we have in over a decade, he still occasionally slips back into old patterns, a cancelled visit here, a promise that arrives a little later than it should there, and when that happens, I've learned to say so, directly and without the old, worn-out fear that naming it clearly will cost me whatever fragile progress we've made. It hasn't, not once. I think, in a strange way, the honesty is actually what's held the progress in place. My relationship with my mother has become something I genuinely could not have predicted 3 years ago, closer in some ways than it's ever been, precisely because illness stripped away so much of the careful performance that used to sit between us. She tells me things now she never would have told me before, about her own childhood, her own specific fears, the particular loneliness of raising 2 children largely on her own and never quite trusting herself to get it right. I don't think either of us would have arrived at this kind of honesty without everything that came before it, the decades of imbalance, the slow reckoning, the specific, undramatic work of actually showing up for someone once it finally, undeniably mattered. She told me, a few weeks ago, sitting together on the back porch on one of her better days, that she used to lie awake some nights during my childhood worrying specifically about Jason Brooks, imagining all the ways his particular softness might let the world hurt him, and that she never once lay awake worrying about me in that same way, not because she loved me less, she said carefully, but because some part of her simply trusted, without ever examining why, that I would be fine regardless of what she did or didn't do. She said she understood now, in a way she hadn't let herself understand for most of my life, that a child being fine on her own isn't actually the same thing as a child not needing to be worried about, and that the difference between those two things had cost me more than she'd ever allowed herself to see clearly until she was the one who needed taking care of. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I didn't tell her, because I didn't need to, that I'd understood that difference myself for a very long time. I've made a genuinely good life out of all of this, not despite the years of feeling like the less favored child, but in some strange, specific way, because of the discipline and self-reliance those years quietly built into me, whether I wanted them to or not. I don't resent my capability anymore, the way I sometimes used to, back when being capable simply felt like the reason nobody worried about me. I've come to see it, instead, as the exact thing that let me build a life sturdy enough to hold both myself and my mother when she finally, actually needed holding. What I want to leave you with, more than the specific details of who gave what to whom across 3 decades of a complicated family, is this. Being the child who needed less was never actually the same thing as being loved less, even though it took me most of my life to understand the difference clearly enough to stop confusing the two. If you've spent years being the reliable one in a family that seemed to reserve its softness for someone else, I want you to hear me say that your reliability was never a smaller kind of love. It was simply a kind that nobody thought to notice, until the day they finally, desperately needed it. I don't know exactly how many years I'll have left with my mother. Parkinson's doesn't offer anyone a clean timeline, and I've stopped asking her doctors for one, because I've learned, over this past year especially, that the specific number matters less than what we actually do with whatever time turns out to be there. What I do know is that when she needed someone, fully and completely, I was there, not because I owed her that, not to settle some old score decades in the making, but because that's simply who I turned out to be, underneath everything, regardless of how unevenly the love in our house was ever divided. That's my story. A childhood of quiet imbalance, a brother who finally learned to show up, and a mother who needed me exactly when it mattered most, on a timeline none of us chose and none of us could have predicted. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the dependable one in a family that took your dependability for granted, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.